Because then Sisi told the judges in Egypt, Egypt's honor is being violated on the street. And I'm like, fuck that. It's not Egypt's honor, it's Egyptian women. This isn't about honor. This is about women and women's bodies. Because when it stays between the military and the Islamists, it's constantly each side of them fighting over my body and who owns it. And neither of them owns it. I own it. And that's where the social section revolution comes in. So I hate this question when people say, were women better under Mubarak? How on earth is anyone better under a dictator? Of course they weren't. But it's a very long, long struggle. And if you want optimism, the story I give is of a 19-year-old, and I repeat the story over and over, a 19-year-old Egyptian man who invited me to speak at a TEDx event in his university in a very conservative town called Zagazig. It's where the Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi, was born. And he said to me, our community, a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated town, needs a feminist like you to come and shake us up. That's the social section revolution beginning.
Fantastic, thank you. You have, if I had a PowerPoint right now, and sometimes I do this when I give talks about this, the PowerPoint right now would be photographs from Afghanistan and Iraq and Egypt in the 60s of women who are our mother's age, at the age that we are now, or younger, in miniskirts. Mm-hmm. In the 60s, in Afghanistan, women not only walked around without the burqa, they walked around in dresses like the one I have on right now. Those were secular dictatorships, correct? At that time. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna put this question to you, Ani, and I also want you to get to Tunisia because you're fresh back from there. Mm-hmm. Contrary to what Mona just said about the military, nobody's happy under a dictatorship, but isn't it true that women in the Middle East were a lot better off under secular dictatorships in Iraq and all the other countries than they are under the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood taking over Egypt, and then they are in the Gulf states where they are, can be beaten with sticks, and Iran?
Yes and no. So Iraq, definitely, that is the case. Tunisia, however, is the same. So I guess it depends on what sort of dictatorship and also the enlightenment of that particular dictatorship. So Tunisia, for example, had an enlightened leader. He did away with polygamy in the 50s. The Constitution actually allows for women to divorce the husband with no excuse needed. Tunisian Constitution also allows for freedom of belief, freedom of conscience, and this is in the 50s.
This is the new Constitution.
No, they call it the new Constitution, but it's actually the same as the old one when in this particular three issues. So there is a as far as women's rights, I think it really is when you have a dictatorship, your values, what that particular dictator's values is enforced onto you. So there is no freedom to express yourself. In that sense, some cultural, some of the religious elements goes underground, right? And so now with that oppression eliminated, there is the freedom to express yourself. The freedom to express yourself comes in both ways. It comes in many shapes. If I may share some story here, I had a conversation with the advisor of the president of Indonesia. And he's the religious advisor of the president of Indonesia. And I'm challenging him, and I'm saying, why do you allow the Hizb ut-Tahrir, the radical groups from India, from Pakistan, from Iran, from Saudi Arabia to set up shop in Indonesia? Because Indonesia, like Malaysia, used to be a very easygoing Sufi style. Everyone is happy, we're all different, so what? We go celebrate each other's holidays. It used to be like that, but now the progressive Indonesians, for example, are being very squeezed by all these different elements of radicals. And his answer was, well, democracy, like many of the despots that we got rid of in the Middle East, is a tricky one because we're learning how to run a democratic country. So we are still struggling. So where does this freedom begin and end? And at what point do we say no to Hizb ut-Tahrir and yes to progressive and no to this and that? So they're all struggling, like when I was saying that it's not something that happens overnight. It's not something you sign up and you know how to do. It's a learning curve and it's a learning process, and governments are also learning that. Tunisia is going through an immense struggle internally on how to balance the religious radicalism that has reared its head, and the secularism that has been traditionally Tunisian. So, for example, for the 2 years of the short period of time that the Islamists took over in Tunisia, it was the Nahda party. Now, in the scheme of things, the Nahda party, Tunisian Islamist party, is very moderate compared to Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist parties. But for Tunisians, they were conservative. For Tunisians, it's not the Tunisian cup of tea of Islam, or what I call Tunisian Islam, because Tunisian Islam is much more liberating than the Wahhabism. And it's unfortunate that Tunisia is not rich to propagate its Islam. Instead, we have the Wahhabism. So when the Nahda party came into office, they appointed their imams at the mosques. And but what happened was the labor unions, the women's rights, the secularists, these four quartets that won the Nobel Peace Award, they mobilized the population and they fought back. And as a result, there's this whole negotiation process that happened in Tunisia, and so that's why Tunisia is upheld, as far as I'm concerned, the model from which the Muslim world needs to follow. And so now that the secular government is back, there is still a struggle because you have the conservative imams that were then asked to leave, and they were kicked out of their positions, and then the secular party now has appointed their imams. Their imams obviously teach, and their sermons are more about egalitarian, about equality, because that's what Tunisia is about. That's what their constitution about. And so now there's that religious struggle that's going on in Tunisia. So those are some of the dynamics that's happening. It's healthy, but it's something to watch. And when Americans need to support Tunisia. If Tunisia falls, it's a shame, because I feel that Tunisia is the example. They constitutionally, socially, they are advanced compared to the rest of the Muslim world. Support them with economically, trade, go visit them, do whatever you can.
Thanks. You've just answered my next question, which was going to be, what can we as a nation and as women in the United States be doing? What should we be doing to be supporting these women in these countries? But you've addressed that, and I realize that we've had so much fun here. We're down to 5 minutes left, and I was going to open it to questions before we adjourn. So I'm going to do that, but I have one last question for you two, and it is my throwaway question. Have either of you ever worn a burkini?
Bikini.
Bikini, yes. Okay. But no. I saw one. I was in Sharm el Sheikh a couple of years ago, and I saw this woman head to toe in a neoprene putting suntan oil on her man, who was naked down to a Speedo, and he was this big walrus covered with hair.
Oh, no.
And you're thinking, she's beautiful, and she's under the neoprene, and it's just unbelievable. But the burkini is just fascinates me. So anyway, but neither of them have. So let's open it to. Let's have a couple of questions from the audience. And sorry we didn't start this a bit earlier. I was just so caught up with their.
There's one behind on that side, just so if you don't see on the right.
Got
side.
it. Okay. Let's see here. You back there.
Yeah.
Oh wait. Who?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hello.
I was just gonna comment. What do you think about the recent presidential candidates talking about Ben Carson saying, "I wouldn't vote for a Muslim president," or Donald Trump as well saying that? Well, I was gonna say, what do you guys think about that?
I think it's become GOP policy to compete to see who can say the shittiest thing about Muslims. So I think that's clear.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dara. I'm a student at USC. My question was on interpretation. And basically, as I look at all religions, they're not sticking to the beliefs that are written my critique, but my question is, what keeps you guys from not calling your interpretation of the Quran something else besides Islam? Why do you keep calling it Islam? And I don't mean that in a negative way, I'm just curious.
I'll be happy to answer that question. So we do a lot of work at the United Nations, and both in New York and in Geneva. And some of these Muslim majority countries, they justify their human rights abuses in the name of Sharia law, what they call God's law. Well, it's actually 100% man-made. It's not God's law. If it's really truly God's law, as they claim, then why is it different in other Muslim majority countries? It's not uniform. So when you're talking about Sharia law, everyone's freaking out about Sharia law here in the United States, and they're banning it. Well, which Sharia law, right? Because there's different forms of Sharia law. So when we challenge these Muslim majority countries, like, for example, child marriage. But hang on a second, in the Quran it clearly states that marriage is between two consenting souls. But that's a hadith, that's not a Quran. A hadith is a collection of writings that were written by men 100 years, 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad died. So give me a break. No, I know, but thank you for asking though, just because it's an opportunity for me to explain it. But that is the problem with a lot of the Islamic, so-called Islamic law, because it's not God's law, it's man-made. And the thing is, let me, 1 minute to explain you what Sharia and what Sharia law is. They're two different concepts. Sharia is the watering hole that quenches your spiritual thirst. It's not codified, it's not a law, it's just a guidance in the Quran on how to live a good ethical life. It's about ethics. It's about humanity. It's about caring for each other, for the animals, for the environment. Our environment is big in the Quran. Sharia law happens 100 to 200 years after Prophet Muhammad died. And so what happened is you have these religious politicians. They started thinking, oh, how do we control our population? And so what they decided to do, they started taking their extrapolations of the Quran and then the social norms of the day. So that's why we have child marriage, FGM, that is supposedly God's law. And they have norms that predated Islam. And they mashed it all up together. And then they go to the sheikh who is on their payroll. Hey, stamp this and make this religious. And there we go, we have Sharia law. And that has continued through the centuries. It has changed a little bit depending on the society and the country, because Sharia law in Malaysia is different from Pakistan, from Morocco, and so on and so forth. And so that's Sharia and Sharia law in a nutshell.
Would you like to address that?
I just want to remind you as well that Muhammad's first wife was a woman called Khadija. She was his only wife until she died. Khadija was the first person to become a Muslim. Khadija employed Muhammad. She was incredibly rich and powerful, and she was 15 years older than him. And when she was 40 and he was 25, she proposed and he accepted. And being a woman who has a thing for younger men, Khadija's my role model.
She was a cougar.
She was the first Muslim cougar, yeah?
Wait, let's get a woman here. Yes, you back there. Yes.
I don't call them the Islamic State. I call them Daesh, which is actually their acronym in Arabic, but they don't like it, and so I use it because they don't like it. And they're the so-called Islamic State. But
What does it actually mean in Arabic, Daesh?
الدولة الإسلامية في الشام والعراق. So it's أو في العراق والشام. So it's literally the acronym in Arabic. The various Arabic letters. So, but here's the thing. I mean, I don't call them the Islamic State, but I have to acknowledge that they do use certain things in Islam to justify what they do, based on the way the Saudis have fucked up our religion. So I'm taking on the Saudis primarily, because the Saudis, they're beheading people left, right, and center, and they have a government that gets weapons from the United States. So I'm taking on the Saudis and these murderous rapist shits called Daesh, because I connect the two. So what I try to do when I talk about them is connect the two. Ani probably can tell you more about what they do in MPV.
So I'm going to broaden that circle because it's not just about Daesh or Saudi Arabia. Okay, so let's take the issue of apostasy. And the Quran is very clear that there's no compulsion in faith. And there are several other verses that talks about the right to choose your faith or not to believe and so on and so forth. There is no punishment for not believing in a God in the Quran on earth. There may be punishment at a later date, but that's a different story. Now, the fact is, none of the Muslim countries actually have freedom of choice, freedom of belief. None of the Muslim countries. The form of punishment varies. In Malaysia, you are forced to enter a rehab center, and until you decide to stay in Islam. In Saudi Arabia, they chop your head off. In Afghanistan or in Pakistan, depending on what province you are, they stone you, or the vigilante just kills you, because they do believe that apostasy is punishable by death, which is a completely false teaching based on what the Quran is. So it's not just Daesh, it's not just what Saudi Arabia, it is actually the Muslim world, with the exception of Tunisia, because, like I said earlier, it's constitutionally allowed. And so I think the challenge as Muslims is to go at the root of it, which is we use sacred texts in a positive and affirming way to counter the sacred texts that is being used in a negative way. Because we believe that if you're going to counter human rights abuses in the name of Islam, that is supposedly God's law, the only language that's going to resonate for them is the language of religion. And so that's what we do in our work.
Join MPV.
Yes, sir.
What would you propose to do about ISIS and such? What is the proper response? Boko Haram as well, if you want to bring them in. But
So it's a long haul, and it is really about the ideology. But it's not just about the ideology. Okay, so I'm 53 years old, and I've lived in Egypt, and it's a poor country. I've seen a lot of Muslim societies that have been poor and oppressed through the decades. But they were never angry, they were never terrorists, they never killed anyone, but they were poor and oppressed. So why is it different now? Right, so now it's been politicized. Now religion has been inserted into the politicization of it. And so it's being used as an excuse, and it's being used to manipulate people to join this Daesh. So the counter to it is for Muslims themselves to interpret Islam, to fight back against that ideology. That's the only long-term solution. I think people are already starting to leave Daesh, because there are youngsters that's gone there thinking that this is an ideal, the caliphate. Well, let me first say to you and to the Muslims, so hang on a second, why does the idea of defending a caliphate appeal to you in the first place? So a lot of I've seen the Daesh recruiting tools. I've sat with Homeland Security. I've gone through the recruiting magazines, and every page they use Islamic content. So why is this particular Islamic content resonating for some of us in the Muslim community? It doesn't resonate for me, right? But it resonates for some of us. So then the question we should be asking the Muslim organizations in America, why is this appealing? Is a dog whistle here somewhere that we're not hearing, right? And so there is an ideology, an ideological fight going on within the Muslim community everywhere in the world. And as a progressive Muslim that does education of reinterpreting Islam, working with progressive Muslim scholars and philosophers, and we have many of them. They are not aliens. They do exist, but the problem is they don't get the support like the radical imams, the radical scholars do from the Saudis, okay? This is all about money.
Yes, ma'am.
So there are so many anomalies that exist, like you just mentioned. People are going in droves to Daesh because they feel some sort of sense of need for community or supporting the caliphate. And then here in the United States, those same people probably experience some sense of disenfranchisement, from the media and from, society in general. And then we have within the Muslim community, we have things like, Paris Hilton's, selling purses in Mecca, and yet, it's just, there are so many things going on that are at odds with each other. There are so many things that just don't make sense. And so in trying to combat all these anomalies, how can we make our voices louder? How can we make progressive Muslims' voices more well heard, so that when people talk about Islam, it's not just about these strange anomalies that exist, these people going to extremist organizations, but it's more about people like you, Ani, and people like you, Mona, who are out there trying to fight the good fight.
Well, I think it's having more voices like ours on panels like this, inviting less men, inviting less conservative men, and recognizing that we exist. And this young woman here, you already are engaged in that because you have a radio show in which you highlight the work of Muslim women artists, which again exists. So it's moving away from the image that you see of Muslims in the media, and the image is usually what I call angry bearded Muslim man and covered in black Muslim woman. That's it. Those are the only two alternatives. And if they're not yelling at you and like seeming to reach out of your TV screen and burning flags, usually America and Israel, they don't exist. You never see pictures on the media of happy Muslim men, of Muslim men celebrating something. They're usually burning something. And you never even hear Muslim women. It's like we don't have a voice. And here we are, women who are very verbose, as you can see. So we need to be in every single panel and not even just talking about Islam. Because you know what? I love football, soccer in your language. Yeah. I love soccer. I love to dance. I love poetry. I love the theater. I love museums. But do I get invited on to talk about the latest exhibit at the MoMA? No. I'm invited on to talk about Daesh all the time. Yeah. I'm a human being, for fuck's sake.
I